for your attention. I will now turn it over to the presenters.
Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Leslie Orloff. I'm with the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project, and I wanted to welcome you to this webinar today on public benefits and services legally available to immigrant children and crime victims, what courts need to know. And I want to thank our sponsor for this webinar and our partners for this webinar. The sponsor is the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and our partner organization sponsoring this is the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. So I direct the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project. I'm a family lawyer and have been involved in drafting the Immigration Protections of the Violence Against Women Act and Public Benefits Access for Battered Immigrants, and helping work with government agencies to implement those provisions, many of which we're going to be talking about today. Judge Livingston?
Thank you. I want to add my thanks to Ms. Orloff's thanks for your participation in the webinar this afternoon. I hope that we will learn as much from you as you will learn from us. It's one of the things that always makes these webinars so valuable for us. I want to begin by just talking a little bit about what our goals are for the session. The learning objectives for us really is that we hope that at the end of the workshop you're going to be able to know much more than you do now about which publicly funded benefits and services might be available to crime victims and children without regard whatsoever to their immigration status. There are a number of programs and services that are available to folks no matter their status, and we want to talk a little bit about those today. And then, of course, depending on particular status, we will talk more about what might be available depending on what the status might be at any given time. And we certainly want to talk about what's available to you in your state. And so I'm so grateful for the folks at NIWAP who have developed a benefits map so that you can use this interactive map to go state by state and find out what's available in your state, how you can access those benefits for the folks and the families that you're working with. We also want to spend a minute talking to the judges in the audience about the orders that those judges enter that reflect the programs and services for immigrant litigants and their families that might be eligible to receive, and the benefits about why that's so important for us to do. But before we dig into the real deep dive of it all, I think I'd like to know at least a little bit about who has joined us on the webinar. So now that we've all sort of figured out who's who and how this technology works, if you could just let us know sort of what your primary work involves. So judges, judicial education staff, court staff, law clerks, etc. If you could just fill in the answers to those questions, please.
Multiple people are typing.
Great. Well, it looks like we've got some diversity in our audience. That's always good.
Attorneys, social workers, California, Wisconsin, North Carolina, some people from the courts, accredited representative counselors. Great.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Well, I appreciate the diversity of interest and the diversity of the work that you do. I would sort of point out, at least from my perspective anyway, that it really does take all of us to do the work that we do. The judges could not do what they do without the benefit of law clerks and staff and clerks and everyone else. And so it really is a team effort to make this justice system work for all of our citizens. And so I'm so grateful to all of you for your interest, but also for all the work you do back home. So let's just spend just a minute or so about why this information is so important for judges to know about. If we were in a small group setting face-to-face, I would call on a couple of you to say, hey, why is this important to the work that you do? But in the interest of time, what I would like to do is just tell you from my perspective why it's important to me. One of the things that I'm trying to do, of course, is, and I think most judges are trying to figure out a way to help families move from whatever brings them to the crisis point that brings them to the courthouse to some better place, particularly for families with children and particularly for folks who have been the victims of domestic violence and any kind of other trauma, really. We want to get people in a better position. I'm aided in my effort to do that when I have good, accurate, up-to-date information about what's available to people to use. So if it's everything from, TANF to daycare assistance or, educational programs, food programs, anything at all that's going to help me help families move from the crisis that brings them to my courtroom out back into the community in a place that will keep them being self-sufficient and really back on their feet. That's what I'm looking for. And so the more information I have, the better outcome I can predict, the better my court orders will be, the more tailored and specific they will be, and the better able I think we all are to see success and a relief from some of the trauma that brings people into our system. That's, I think, generally kind of the goal for me and why this information is so important for judges to know about. We're going to talk a little bit more later on about what we do with the information that we get, but I think at the start, this is a good sort of beginning place for us to understand why this information is so important. You have your raise your hand function on the you did that so well in the first instance. Let me just ask you to raise your hand if you, as a judge or the judges you work with, order parties to seek public benefits. Do you ever see in your court orders an affirmative direction from the court, a court order that says you must apply for this benefit or that benefit?
And this is
oftentimes I know. Go
raise
ahead.
your hand function is at the top in the center. It's a little guy raising his hand with an arrow down below, and you can say agree, disagree, etc.
Let's hit agree if you're in a court setting in which the judge has actually ordered people to do it. I know very often that some judges will say, these things are available in our community, why don't you apply for them? But I think in some cases it might be something that a judge might consider making a court order. I've done it in some cases where I didn't think people would necessarily follow through and I needed to provide them some direction about how to do that. Sometimes that's because the parents themselves are in a mental health situation or otherwise not able to really navigate or just really are lost in terms of what to do next. And so sometimes I'll put things in a court order, not so much because I want the hammer of enforcement, but because I want to lay out a roadmap for what's what and who needs to do what so that we can have a kind of a game plan for how we're going to manage the case. And so for me, sometimes I'll make a suggestion, but sometimes I'll actually make that a court order. Okay, so what kinds of cases do these orders work in? So here's another sort of dialogue box that you can answer. What kind of cases do you see this happening in? Are they sort of plain old custody cases? Are they abuse and neglect? Everybody's seeing them in custody cases. We always see them in the CPS, the child welfare context. That's pretty typical. Oftentimes in divorce. What about in delinquency court? Nobody's yet picked that box. Are people seeing them there, or are we just an audience that doesn't really deal with those cases as much? I will tell you, we see them in delinquency in my community, and several of you have chosen all of the above. I'm not surprised by that at all. All right.
And that can happen both when there's orders or when the court is giving some direction to parties. I mean, it can happen in different contexts, but that's good to get a sense of where people are typically seeing these issues arise. So what we're going to, actually, no.
Well, the next slide is just, the next slide really just has to do with, kind of a pointer to the fact that in addition to what you've already responded to, you should know that these same kinds of issues are very prevalent among children and kids who are in families where their parents have been or they have been victims of a crime. And so Leslie's now going to kind of run through for us some of these specific programs that are open depending on status or not depending on status. And so I'm going to turn it over to her now for that.
Great. So what we're going to do is this first section, I'm going to talk about what everybody is entitled to without regard to immigration status. So these are programs I'm going to start with, and this is, I've got a picture up here of a brochure that's in the materials on the web page that I posted earlier. And they're available, you'll receive the link after the webinar as well to the web page. But this is, there are programs that are open to everyone without regard to immigration status. So this is true generally. So for example, there are widely available public services, police, courts, ability to come to court and get a protection order, custody, participate in a criminal case, get child support. That is open to everyone without regard to immigration status, as are things like fire, ambulance, sanitation. From a legal services perspective, there continues to be a lot of misinformation out there about what immigrants can get legal services. And what's important for this audience to know is that legal services are open to income-eligible victims of crime without regard to their immigration status. So immigration status is not a bar to getting representation by any legal services agency in the country without regard to who their funding comes from. If their funding comes from the Legal Services Corporation funded programs can represent victims of domestic violence, child abuse, stalking, sexual assault, human trafficking, any other U-Visa listed crime, criminal activity, and generally the initial representations are things related to overcoming, surviving, healing, preventing abuse. But they are available, and it's important for judges and for everybody in communities to know. There was a major change in the law change that opened up legal services happened in 2005. The regulations implementing them came out in 2014, and so we've seen a lot more legal services agencies serving victims as they should have been able to as of 2005. But what also both documented and undocumented immigrant victims can get is language access, which all immigrants have access to the courts, to police, to prosecutors, to victim services, to any program that receives any government funding. Victims are eligible for crime victim services, shelter, transitional housing. They can obtain public benefits for their children. And Judge Livingston, you were talking about health care. They can get emergency medical care through emergency Medicaid, and they can receive health care from HHS-funded community and migrant health clinics without regard to immigration status. Any judge, any advocate or attorney, any person working with a victim can look up where these public health clinics are by going to these websites and literally entering the client's zip code, and it will tell them the closest HHS-funded clinics. And then there are also, from a health perspective, state-funded programs, which we'll go over later in the webinar. And in almost every state but Alabama, all immigrant victims are able to get post-assault health care funded by VOCA. A smaller group of immigrants are able to get it in Alabama. And these are the kinds of health care that are available from these federally qualified health care programs. So it covers a lot of things: prenatal care, like routine, adult health care, child health care, important screenings for cancer and wellness and things like that, and some mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment is available depending on the clinic as well. And then we have, one of the things I'm going to be doing throughout this is highlighting resources. So we have charts where you can look up by state the details of how somebody would get VOCA-funded post-assault health care in your state, what emergency Medicare covers in your state, whether immigrants and how immigrants and everybody else can make sure that the forensic exams they need in sexual assault cases are paid for, and then whether or not a client can access prenatal care if they're an immigrant varies by state, and we have a chart that tracks that independent and in addition to the public benefits maps I'm going to be talking about later. So in addition to what I've talked about so far, there are services in 1996, when immigration and welfare reforms were written, there were immigrant restrictions placed on benefits, and then the two bills, the immigration bill and the welfare bill, designated the Attorney General of the United States the power to decide what programs, because they were necessary to protect life and safety, should be exempt from any immigrant restrictions. And so under Janet Reno's leadership, there was an Attorney General's order that came out that said basically anything that it's available as in-kind services provided at the community level, not based on an income or individual's income or resources, that is necessary to protect life and safety, is open to everyone. And what's important to think about, the way I think about this here, is the hard one is not based on the individual's income or resources. So what is an example of services that you guys can think of that isn't based on income or resources, that's open to everyone? Can you type in some examples? Get anybody typing? A couple of them? Oh, guess not. Judge Livingston, do you have some ideas, thoughts?
Well, you know, what?
I don't mean to put you on this.
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank a little bit because I'm looking at the typing beer. I see never over there, and I thought, wow, that seems
that was from before. So,
okay, I was like, what? But,
no, I think the best example I can think of is domestic violence programs, right? So the local shelter wouldn't turn away the mayor's daughter or the wife of the richest guy in town. It's not about income or resources. It's about being a victim of domestic violence. So that's an example of someone, or, you know, if somebody, you know, is in their home is destroyed by fire or something like that, and they need to go to, they might have money, but they would qualify for a soup kitchen under certain circumstances. So there are things that are open. That's what that means by income or resources, that it's generally open to anybody who needs that service for that person. And so this is an example of the kinds of benefits that are available under this life and safety category. So crisis and abuse intervention, adult and child protective services, victim services. So, you know, victim services are open to victims without regard to immigration status. Sexual assault resources and counseling and support groups, exactly. Those are, you know, things that happen with relation to adverse weather conditions, soup kitchens, community food banks. This is where transitional housing comes in and shelter comes in. And then certain nutrition programs like WIC, the Women Infant Children Program, or school lunches, or things like, well, Women Infant Children, or some of the senior programs that feed people might qualify under this. Additionally, elementary and secondary school education is open to everyone without regard to immigration status. The same thing with school lunch and breakfast programs, WIC, immunization and testing programs for communicable diseases. And then the other thing that's important to note here is that if a child, there are many, many families that are what we call mixed income status, mixed immigration status. And that means maybe you have a child who's a citizen, and you have one parent who's a lawful permanent resident, and you have another parent who's undocumented, or another child who's undocumented. You'll have mixed statuses within the family. The parent or guardian or adult caretaker of a child who qualifies for benefits can go and apply for benefits for that child without regard to the immigration status of the parent, and without having to answer immigration status or social security number questions regarding the parent, only because the parent isn't additionally applying for additional dollars or funding from that benefits agency for themselves. They're only applying for the children. And those rules have been in place for decades now, and have remained in place throughout any changes in government that have occurred. So they started back in the 80s and have continued till the present, or the 90s actually, and continues to the present.
So,
go ahead.
Sid, you ready?
Yep.
All right. So, so that's really, excuse me, that's really helpful. And this next question, if you want to comment on, I'd love to hear your comments about examples that you might be able to provide in situations that you are familiar with where knowing this information is super helpful. One thing I want to say about it while you're typing is that, you know, I don't know about the communities that you live in, but, you know, here in Texas where we have a lot of people crossing the border on a regular basis, you would think that the professionals in our state would know more than the average person about some of these rights and duties and programs and so forth, but that would be a wrong assumption. So the way this plays out very often is that people will come into the courthouse and there will just be these urban myths about what's available or what's not available, or who can access what, or who can, be dependent on their status, you know, take advantage of this or that or the other. And you'll hear things like, well, they're not here legally, so they can't do that, right? You know, there's not real good, solid information available. Well, it's available, but people don't really know off the top of their heads what's available, what's not available. So when they come to the courthouse, that problem persists here as well. So in my mind, knowing what is available, whether or not it depends on status, is enormously important for judges who are crafting court orders that are either going to help people get out of a crisis or set them up for failure and exacerbate a problem that already existed when they came to the courthouse. So it's super important for us to know, but I would just pause a minute in case anybody else has another example of how that might be important or why it might be important for judges to know. I would add advocates to know as well, but certainly for judges.
And while we're waiting for the typing, I'll point that out. We did some research not too long ago looking at access to transitional housing and shelter for immigrant victims, and one of the things we found was that particularly with regard to transitional housing, these myths that you're talking about, Judge, were really a problem because one of the reasons that victims didn't apply is that their advocates told them they didn't qualify, or their lawyers told them they didn't qualify when they did. And so I've posted the link again, is that we really want you to think of this webinar as kind of an entree or an introduction or a door through which you can learn about. We've tried, what we've done a lot of work at NIWAP about is trying to give you resources at your fingertips, so when a client walks in and you need to know, you know, does she qualify for TANF in my state? Where can she get health care? That you can actually look it up on the spot and have legally correct information that we're keeping constantly up to date.
Well, I don't see anybody typing in the anything new, so I think we can move on. I think it's pretty obvious in some respects why this is so important and the value of having this really helpful information.
So what I'm going to do now is just very briefly, so what happens is I've talked to you up until now about what's available to anybody with regard to immigration status. Now I'm going to talk to you about how once a crime victim or a child who's a victim begins to file for immigration status, how that increases their access to public benefits, both federal and state public benefits. So these are the major forms of immigration relief that are available to immigrant victims. There's something called the VAWA self-petition, which helps U.S. citizens. Basically, these are spouses, abused spouses and children of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. The U visa is open generally for crime victims that can be domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and a variety of child abuse, elder abuse, stalking, and a variety of other kinds of criminal activities. Trafficking victims have both access to a T visa for trafficking victims and continued presence, which is a form of relief that is earlier. And then there's special immigrant juvenile status for children. And each of these has a different level of access to public benefits. So what happens is that generally the easiest way to think about this is that trafficking victims always have the most among all of the immigrant crime victims you work with. If somebody's a victim of trafficking or could qualify to apply for a T visa, they'll have the most benefits access in every state. VAWA self-petitioners will have actually similar to trafficking victims, they get the same access as refugees and asylees. Lawful permanent residents in many states, if you're applying for a U visa or special immigrant juvenile status, that applicant will only become a qualified immigrant for benefits purposes once they gain lawful permanent residency. SIJS children get access to health care sooner. I'll be talking about that in a little bit. And VAWA self-petitioners have pretty good access to, in many states, to a wide range of public benefits. Immigrants who are not qualified and have little or no access to public benefits, with a very few exceptions, are the group on the right, which includes U visa applicants, people that have U visas, people on work visas, student visas, diplomatic visas, people who are undocumented, DACA children, and asylum applicants. So that there's a lot of people that don't have any access at all, other than the programs I was talking about earlier. And so becoming a qualified immigrant, as I said, increases access to state and federal public benefits. And all qualified immigrants get some access to public benefits, and I'll go over which ones. But what an immigrant gets who's applying for one of these statuses depends on which status. So I was talking about, for example, T visa victims have dramatically more access to public benefits than U visa victims. When they entered the United States, so immigrants who came into the United States more than 1996, prior to August 22nd, 1996, have much more access to public benefits than people who came after. And in fact, I know for a fact that many of you may be working. It's important to look, at when somebody entered, because you might be working with older victims who qualify. And then there's some programs like TANF, Medicaid, SSI that have heightened requirements. I'll go over that. And what benefits vary by state. And so it's important, and we'll go over some of that. So generally speaking, this tells you when victims become qualified immigrants or lawfully present for benefits purposes. Generally speaking, again, VAWA self-petition, battered spouse waiver, continued presence, and T visa here on the left have the most access. Special immigrant juvenile status children get health care as lawfully present upon filing. When U visa victims are waitlist approved, which is happening 5 to 6 years after filing now, they get access to the health care exchanges as similar to the SIJS children. And basically there's a category of victims married to U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents where the abuser has filed immigration papers for the victim. If there are a group of those cases where you could prove battering, extreme cruelty, and they can get access to public and assisted housing. And we have a whole other webinar on that one I can link you to. I'll put the link on the site when we're done with this webinar. So these are benefits classifications. I'm not trying to overwhelm you with words that don't make any sense in the real world. But the point about this is these are the categories. These are the titles of categories, and they do make a difference from public benefits perspective. And I put the definitions here so you can look them up later on as you're using these materials. But generally speaking, citizens get everything from public benefits perspective. Qualified immigrants get the next most. Lawfully present immigrants get basically access to the health care exchanges, but they don't get subsidies, depending on the state. And some states offer state-funded benefits to lawfully present immigrants and to immigrants that are what are called permanently residing under color of law, which basically means they filed an immigration application and DHS knows they're in the country. So if we talk about qualified immigrants, we're talking about, from a victim perspective, we're talking about SIJS children who got lawful permanent residency, VAWA self-petitioners, T visa applicants, and continued present recipients, so trafficking victims, those groups, refugees, asylees. They get public and assisted housing, post-secondary educational grants and loans, driver's licenses, most subsidized health care, childcare, but not necessarily. TANF depends on the state. I'll get to that in a little bit. This gives you an idea of some of the other programs.
So Leslie, you've got a couple of questions in the chat box. Did you want to check those out before we move on?
You want to do the poll while I read?
All right. While Leslie's reading over the questions from Tatiana and Christopher, let me ask those of you to please answer this question and vote for which of these following items listed below is not eligible for public and or assisted housing, do you think? Let's see how well you're doing on our Jeopardy quiz today.
I think they know what they're talking about. Give you a few more seconds.
And my suggestion, Leslie, is maybe you could just answer those questions out loud so that everybody has the benefit of it and we don't have to take the time to spell check typing.
I will definitely do that. So the answer, you guys are correct. 90% of you got this right. It's U visa holders. Everybody else in this group does get access to public and assisted housing. As to the question about veterans from Christopher, basically there are abused spouses of veterans actually get more. There's more exception. There's more access to them. For example, if you're in a state where there's a 5-year bar to benefits, they can get a waiver to that benefit. They can get access without having to wait the 5 years as spouses of veterans. The benefits, the state benefits charts that I posted actually go into details about the veterans' benefits in the footnotes and in some of the provisions as well, so we cover that in the chart. As to the question from Indiana, there's a policy that has been in place for almost 2 decades now, that says that if the question is whether or not, how is it that they don't ask about Social Security number or legal status of a parent applying for a child? And there are policies in place that say that if they're going to ask the question and if they're going to turn over that information to the Department of Homeland Security, they must tell the person they're asking that question to in the application process that it's not mandated, it's voluntary to answer the question, and they have to tell them that if they reveal information, let's say that they have a deportation order issued against them, or some information that would be information that the benefits worker would have to turn over to DHS, Department of Homeland Security, they have to inform them before asking the question. Indiana is there's a small number of what we call less than states, states that offer less than the federal minimum. Federal immigration laws in '96 gave states the ability to give state-funded benefits to immigrants, also gave them the ability to give immigrants in their states less than the federal standard, and Indiana is one of those states. So we should do a technical assistance. We're available. You can, at the end of the slides, there's a slide with actually, let me just do this orally. You can call 202-274-4457 or info@niwap.org. Alicia, maybe you could type that in the chat box for everyone and ask those more specific questions. But that's a great example of the type of technical assistance we provide. We'd actually go into your statutes and regulations in Indiana and walk you through the answers to that.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Leslie.
So now what I'm going to do is just generally talk a little bit about some of the big benefits programs and who qualifies among crime victims. First of all, education. When I talk about education, I'm not talking about primary and secondary. That is open to everyone, as I said earlier in the webinar. But when I talk about, when you're talking about post-secondary education, so after high school, community colleges, state colleges, universities, access to FAFSA, the student grants and loans, the immigrant victims who get that are refugees and asylees, VAWA self-petitioners and their children. And in VAWA cases, they get it about 3 months after filing. lawful SIJS children and SIJS and U visa children or adults once they've obtained lawful permanent residency. So for SIJS children, if you filed today, the longest it would take that child to get lawful permanent residency under SIJ is probably 3 years. Most people get them much faster than that, more around 1. So, and it's really important to identify, if you're working with U visa victims, children that they may have who might also have been abused by the children's father who abused the mother. Because those children, in addition to being included in mom's U visa application, are eligible to be included, might be eligible to file for SIJS, which would give them, 1 to 3 year wait to lawful permanent residency as opposed to more than 18 years. Trafficking victims also are eligible for federal student grants and loans and as well. And so in addition, there are states that have state laws. And again, if you go to our public benefits map, you can click on education. I'll be walking you through that at the end of the webinar. And you can see what your state offers, but this gives you an idea of the number of states that offer different kinds of options for undocumented students or immigrant students.
So Leslie, before you head to the means-tested programs, you got another question, and I've asked what state we're talking about, but it's now, I'm seeing it's Illinois. There's a question about whether or not VAWA self-petitioners are eligible for assistance with housing, because she's got a client that has been told that that wasn't the case. So can you clarify that a little bit for someone in Illinois?
Sure. So VAWA self-petitioners are eligible for public and assisted housing from the moment they file their applications. There were policies and procedures issued by HUD that that walk the housing providers through how they have to do a separate, different process for verifying eligibility in cases of immigrant victims compared to everyone else. And it may be that the housing providers that you're working with are unaware of those policies. They're on the webpage that I posted for this webinar. If you go under housing, you will find 2 memos that came out in 2018, one in 2018, one in January 2019, from HUD explaining the procedures for application. And again, if you want more detail, you can call us for technical assistance and we can walk you through, and we can walk the housing provider through the process if needed.
Well, so let me just throw in right here that I think this is a really helpful discussion. It's a great example of how the technical assistance from NIWAP can be beneficial to you, but it also points to the kind of challenges you're going to have and the kind of challenges your clients have when they are told one thing by one provider or another thing by another government entity or some agency they're having to deal with. So again, the benefit of having this information sort of at the ready is going to really empower you and give you the kind of tools you're going to need to deal with these individual circumstances when someone comes and says, oh, but they told me thus and such. So this is a really great example of how getting more of this information out to people is so valuable.
Right, and Judge, one of the other things I think is important here is everybody should know that the fact that the housing provider or the benefits worker or the judge or you or me don't know for sure who applies for what in this area is not surprising. This is very complicated. This is a complicated intersection of immigration law and public benefits laws, and which is why we created the tools we're going to be describing to you now, because we wanted to try to make it easier for people to find what they need, because they are complex, so it's not surprising, and that they've been changing over time, so that it's not surprising that people may not know. What's important to point out is, as to these 4 big main programs, and you heard Judge Livingston talk about healthcare, for example, and food stamps, and TANF as things that people need, which is true, these are the hardest programs to access. And the ones that what people qualify for depends on their immigration status and the state you're in. And I'll be walking you through, and that's what the tools we created will help you look up. Because what happens is, for those programs, generally speaking, from the moment somebody becomes a qualified immigrant, which again is about 3 months after filing the self-petition for VAWA, it is at lawful permanent residency, 18 years after filing for U visas. It is trafficking victims can get it immediately with continued presence, or at about 6 months after filing when they get a bona fide determination for Ts, and SIJS children get qualified immigrant status when they get lawful permanent residency, again, between 1 and 3 years. But then they hit, in most states, a federal 5-year bar to access. And the only people exempt from that 5-year bar are human trafficking victims, and this list here, refugees, asylees, some humanitarian immigrants, but not all. And so what happens is, as I mentioned earlier, then the states have an option. States can, and many have, particularly in the healthcare arena, decided to provide state-funded benefits to immigrants while they're in that 5-year bar waiting period. Some of them have provided it earlier than that to applicants, and I'll go over that. Some states, unfortunately Indiana is an example, Texas actually, Judge, is also an example in some areas, provide in some places for some programs less than the federal standard level. And that's why we did detailed charts with footnotes to citations to regulations and statutes and policies and websites so that you'll be able to look it up in your state when you need to.
Well, so here's another question for us. What are the benefits that are most likely ones that I might order from the bench? And, you know, I'll tell you, the first thing that I'm thinking about is how we're going to get health care for kids. So I'm looking at Medicaid. I'm looking at CHIP. I want to make sure that moms who are breastfeeding and who have infant children are getting, you know, the benefits that they're entitled to. I'm looking in my community not just for the federally funded programs, obviously, but I'm looking for, you know, breast milk banks and, you know, mother's milk banks and all kinds of other things, particularly that might have been offshoots of programs like WIC. I'm looking for childcare to order. You know, TANF is a big one, obviously. I'm also now starting to wonder whether or not things like parenting classes can be paid for under some federally funded program, or, you know, 504 education programs at schools and the like. I haven't seen too many disputes about that. But the big ones really are healthcare, CHIP, WIC, childcare. Those are the big 2 or 3, I would say.
So, Judge, the 504, is that the early childhood education programs?
No, it's the ones for kids with disabilities of some kind who need extra accommodations. You might have a kid with ADHD or something like that who needs some additional time or the ability to use a laptop for exams when other kids can't. You know, there might be any number of accommodations, sit at the top of the class, in the front of the class, you know.
All
whatever.
of those are available as part of public education to everybody without regard to immigration status.
Good to know, right? Because we oftentimes you'll get people that come in who will say, well, I haven't done this for my child, as a defensive posture, right? They'll say, you know, I haven't done this because we're not here legally and we can't access it. And I'll say, yeah, I don't think that's true. Right? And it's going to help me make a decision about which of the 2 parents is really on top of things or not in terms of where I'm going to place these kids.
Right. Gotcha.
In a custody dispute.
Yeah, absolutely. And the breast milk bank that you gave is also another example of some of the more creative things that are available at a community level that are funded by nonprofits, or they're funded, they might have some government grants, but government grants are not federal public benefits. So if a grant comes to a food bank or to a shelter or to a victim services program or to a breast milk bank or whatever, that money, because it's not going into an individual, doesn't have immigration restrictions. So that's a good way of getting at those issues as well. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dive in for the last 15 minutes of this webinar and talk about what's going on at what states offer and how you can find out what your state offers. So TANF, there's a 5-year bar federally. 18 states offer qualified immigrants or actually 18 states offer, all states offer access to trafficking victims. 18 states offer access to various different groups of qualified immigrants. 8 states offer TANF access to waitlist approved U visas, which is at year 3 to 6, depending on the adjudication times. 5 states offer it to applicants for U visas. So sometimes, so you can get TANF in a number of these states, and 7 states offer it to SIJS children when they apply. So knowing if you're in one of those states can be super important. Childcare, there's 2 different, Judge, I know you've talked a number of times about childcare. There's 2 different groups of childcare, 2 different kinds of childcare. There's Childcare Development Fund childcare, which is open to qualified immigrants. So all of those qualified immigrants we were talking about get it. Any citizen children, and what's interesting about CCDF childcare is that they only look at the status of the child. So you could have a citizen child in a family with immigrant parents that are undocumented, and they would qualify.
That's really helpful to know, because so many of the clients that we're seeing, litigants coming to court, are themselves undocumented, but their children were born here in the U.S. and they're under 10. And so there's an increasing population of that demographic, and so this is really helpful.
Yeah, and the other part that's important about this is that when a program is funded, like Head Start or early education kind of programs, when they're funded by CCDF money, they're open to everybody without regard to immigration status. It doesn't matter the status of the child. It could be a non-documented child if it's that educational kind of program. What happens is that when TANF, let me just go back for a second, when somebody gets TANF, they additionally get access to TANF-funded childcare. So that as, identifying, for example, I know Judge Livingston, your court is one of them that hands out in the information at the courts, information about VAWAs and Ts and Us and things like that, along with the other public information. The earlier that people get that information and begin to file, the sooner they're getting into these lines towards getting these cases granted, and then they're on a path to be able to get greater access to benefits sooner as well. As to health care, naturalized citizens have the same access to health care as U.S. citizens. Legal immigrants who are, once they become lawfully present, which is waitlist approval for use, qualified immigrant status for all the qualified immigrants I talked about, filing an application for SIJS, they are able to purchase health care on the exchanges. They don't get subsidies necessarily, that's a different story. And they also can they also can get, there's individual mandated tax penalties, but they also can get tax credits and get into the high-risk pools, and some of the benefits of the health care programs become available to them even when they don't have subsidies. Whether they get the subsidies depends on their state. And in terms of subsidies, so here you're seeing higher numbers of states. SIJS children, 29 states offer state-funded CHIP health care to children. 30 states offer it to qualified immigrants, which include the VAWA self-petitioners, SIJS children, SIJS lawful permanent residents, U visa lawful permanent residents, and their children. Everybody offers it for T visas, and some states will offer it to U visa applicants as well. So, again, how we navigate this is what I'm going to show you in a few minutes. Food stamps, qualified immigrant children, again, the children of VAWA self-petitioners, T visas, SIJS children that get lawful permanent residency, receive SNAP food stamps up to the age of 18. Other adult qualified immigrants have to be disabled or have to have been here before 96. Or they have to wait 5 years. There's a 5-year bar. Trafficking victims get access very early in the process if they file T visas or if they get to continued presence. And we have a brochure on our website on what continued presence is. State-funded food stamps is much fewer states. This is the list of states. It's really only trafficking victims that get state-funded food stamps in all states, and they get federally funded. So they're the only ones that get access. The hardest program is SSI. By and large, only 5 states provide SSI to VAWA self-petitioners, 5 states to U visa applicants, all states to T visa victims. But other than that, it's people who've been here and been working lawful permanent residence for 40 quarters, which is basically 10 years after they got lawful permanent residency. So it's very, very hard to access SSI. Driver's licenses, believe it or not, are a federal public benefit or a state public benefit. They come under the public benefits laws definitions. To receive an ID, recognized, federally recognized ID, most immigrants would have to file an immigration. In some states, their state driver's license in 14 states. In other states, once the person files an immigration case and receives work authorization, they will be eligible for a driver's license. For VAWA self-petitions, work authorization is coming in about 12 to 18 months. VAWA waitlist approvals are 3 to 6 years. T visa bona fide is about 6 months. Continued presence is faster. It's like a couple of months, I think. I don't know what the rates are on DACA. SIJ, lawful permanent residence, is running about 1 to 3 years, depending on the country the child comes from. There's also, you can have a child in a household where who's a citizen, for example, or a child or a parent who qualifies for one of these forms of immigration relief. They can get weatherization assistance as well.
This is really important in places like Houston, where they had a big, tornado hit or a big flooding problem after Hurricane Harvey. So, these kinds of benefits we don't think of necessarily as the frontline ones that are life and death kind of stuff, but for somebody who's got a leaky roof and kids in the house, that can be really important.
Right, and then there's this FEMA disaster assistance. There's a part of the emergency disaster assistance is open to everybody without regard to immigration status. It's a form of disaster relief, but the more longer-term ones that include things like unemployment. So fixing your roof could come under either LAHEAP or FEMA. But unemployment assistance because of a disaster would be something that you have to be a qualified immigrant for. That's kind of how it differs. And again, all of our state charts detail the details of that. So let's get on to the map and the charts. So what you can do is if you go to our benefits map, you'll see this link, and I'll show you in a second what all the pages look like. These are the main 2 links you'll need. This is the benefits map and the charts, and then the link to this webinar, which has a bunch of other materials in addition. So what this looks like when you get to the interactive benefits map, this is what your first page looks like. So you don't see the map at the beginning. You'll see a program, and then you'll go to the map for that program. And what it's going to look like is the programs that are covered, we cover all of these different programs. So you'll be able to see state by state, immigration status by immigration status, who qualifies for each of these programs in your state. And so it looks like this. This is the map, and this is cash assistance. And so if I were going to go to click on New Mexico, let's say, in cash assistance, I go to this map, I click on New Mexico, and I get this, which says, VAWA self-petitioner, eligible with conditions. If I'm working with a self-petitioner, I know she's eligible, and then I'm going to have to go find out the conditions. I click the more information, see the New Mexico Public Benefits chart, and it takes me to the detailed chart with the footnotes on how my client can access that. But I can see that refugees, asylees, T visas, so Judge, when you're doing a case and you can see the ones that are eligible without conditions, they're just eligible. And that's, you don't have to go any farther than this map. When it says with conditions, that means look up the conditions, essentially.
Yeah, super helpful.
So, and then when you go to the benefits charts, you'll see something that looks like this. So here you can see a little of New Mexico. The way these are set up is anything in regular face type is federal benefits, and the parts in italics are the state benefits, and everything has footnotes and endnotes and citations and links to everything, and they're all current and up to date, and we're going to be keeping them current and up to date. But if you're in a state and you find any errors in these charts, this is a work in progress, please call us, and we will do the research and update it, and we can just switch the chart and put the updated chart. Like, it takes us about 24 to 36 hours. It's pretty easy for us to do.
But one other thing I'd say about that is that if you're in a state where things are happening, when your legislature is in session, things are happening pretty fast and pretty dynamic, and so it might be helpful for you to communicate with Leslie and her team to provide more sort of real-time updates, because very often they'll get a call or they'll get technical assistance, and they're going to do the research and they're going to be thorough. But if you're already in your state and you're working on these issues, or you know that it's on the front burner and in your newspapers, let Leslie's team know about that so that they can follow what's happening in each of these states, and this information can continue to be as up-to-date as possible.
Right. We see it as a work in progress that we're all kind of jointly contributing to, because much of the research of this started with people calling us with questions. And honestly, I do training on this nationally, and some of it started with my own frustration of being up late at night in a hotel room trying to work out the details of that state before I present. And I figured if I'm having trouble, then everybody else is too.
Absolutely.
So Judge, how do you think these tools might be useful to judges?
Yeah, somebody's already pointed out what a tremendous resource this is, and I want to echo that comment, because it is super helpful for us at the courts to be able to know who can get what. I said earlier, I don't want to enter court orders that are going to set people up for failure. I don't believe in cookie-cutter justice, and so I don't have standard orders that I just make everybody do for the sake of having a convenient order. I appreciate the need for consistency in the decisions that we make, but I also understand the importance of looking at a particular family with a particular need, with a particular circumstance or situation that requires some very tailored orders that make sense for that particular family. So all of this information is super useful for us here at the courthouse to be able to talk to the advocates about what their homework assignments ought to be. Are you investigating this? Are you looking into that? Is she available for this? Is he eligible for that? So we can direct that inquiry. We can let them know about these resources. We have this information available to us as well. And so just generally speaking, I've become much more educated about what's available in my state, so that when I'm seeing a case, I already know, okay, I can do this, I can do that, I probably shouldn't order that, I might want to order this. I mean, I can't tell you how having this kind of information is so useful to us in able to carry out the work that we have to do here at the courthouse.
Great. So what I'd like to do, I'm just going to go over, in addition, the other materials we have that are on the webpage. For courts specifically, we just recently updated our public benefits bench cards for immigrant victims, so that we have bench cards as well that help courts understand kind of what was on these slides in a quick reference guide bench card format. We also have specific ones for VAWA self-petitions, U visas, and T visas. We have brochures on benefits open to all victims. That brochure I showed you a picture of earlier on in the webinar. We have the state charts we've been discussing. We have some particular materials. Battered immigrants and VAWA self-petitioners and U visas and T visas were exempted from public charge. So we have materials where you can look up that and the privacy protections that relate to the privacy chart was developed by the National Immigration Law Center. It's also excellent. And we have information on legal services and more. And I just want to take as we conclude, I'd like to announce that we're having 3 more webinars in this series. Also the same format, 1 hour, same time. Next one is going to be on special immigrant juvenile status, and it's going to focus on best practice for judges drafting findings and court orders on behalf of, in cases of children seeking special immigrant juvenile status. Then we're going to do one on the legal protections when victims are children and the judge's role, and we're going to go into the various kinds of immigration status protections that are available to children who've been victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, child abuse. We're going to talk about some student visa issues because there could be kids in elementary and high school, in addition to college, that are on student visas. And then the last one, we get a lot of questions from judges about detained immigrant children and parents. What are their rights? What do they qualify for? What do courts need to know? How might courts see these cases, these families? And that'll be our July 9th webinar. So I hope you'll join us, and on behalf of NIWAP and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, we thank you for joining us today. There will be a version of this. There'll be this webinar will be available on the web to see online for people that you may know that didn't get a chance to participate live that might be interested in the information. And we thank you for taking the time to join us today. Judge Livingston?
Thanks so much. Good luck.